For decades, there has been one constant in Chinese politics. The People's Liberation Army answers to the Communist Party, and the party answers to one man at the top. That principle has been unshakable since Deng Xiaoping established the foundations of modern China. But something is shifting inside the most secretive military command structure on Earth. And if even a fraction of what we are seeing is real, it represents a fundamental crack in the system that Xi Jinping has spent over a decade trying to cement. This is not about a coup, at least not in the way Western observers might imagine. This is about something far more complex, far more subtle, and potentially far more dangerous for the man who declared himself the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao. We will examine the evidence, separate the confirmed from the speculative, and show you what this means for the second largest military on the planet. But first, we need to understand what makes this moment different from anything we have seen in modern Chinese military history. The thesis is straightforward. In recent months, public reporting and open-source intelligence have documented an unprecedented wave of personnel changes, unusual command reshuffling, and what some analysts assess as signs of internal friction within the People's Liberation Army command structure. Some of these changes are confirmed through official Chinese state media. Others remain in the realm of speculation, fueled by fragmentary reports and unverified claims circulating through regional media and online platforms. By the end of this analysis, you will know which pieces are solid, which are uncertain, and what to watch for in the weeks ahead. Because whether this represents genuine internal resistance, routine consolidation, or something else entirely, the implications reach far beyond China's borders. They touch on Taiwan contingency planning, regional stability, defense postures across the Indo-Pacific, and the internal coherence of the world's largest standing military force. So what is actually happening? Let us begin with what we can confirm. Since late 2023 and accelerating into early 2025, Chinese state media has reported a series of high-profile removals and replacements within the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, the strategic missile command responsible for China's nuclear deterrent and conventional strike capabilities. According to publicly available statements from China's Ministry of National Defense and reports from state-controlled outlets including Xinhua and the Global Times, multiple senior officers have been removed from their posts. Some were reportedly placed under investigation for corruption. Others simply disappeared from public view without official explanation. These are not low-level staff officers. These are generals who oversaw critical elements of China's strategic forces, the units that would execute any large-scale missile campaign in a Taiwan scenario or broader regional conflict. The removals began with Rocket Force Commander Li Yuchao and Political Commissar Xu Shisheng, both of whom vanished from public events in mid-2023. By late summer of that year, Chinese state media confirmed they were under investigation. Then came the removal of Defense Minister Li Shangfu, whose tenure lasted mere months. What made these removals particularly notable was not just the individuals involved, but the speed and scope. Within a span of 6 months, China had effectively decapitated the leadership of its most critical strategic command. Former officers who had built careers over decades were erased from official rosters overnight. Statements from the Ministry of National Defense were brief, offering little beyond formulaic language about serious violations of discipline. No trials were announced. No detailed charges were made public. The men simply ceased to exist in official Chinese military discourse. The pattern does not stop with the Rocket Force. On open-source tracking by regional defense analysts and think tanks, including the Center for Strategic and International Studies, has documented personnel changes across the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Air Force, and the ground forces. In some cases, these changes align with routine rotations tied to China's 5-year military reform cycles. In other cases, the speed and scope of the reshuffling appear to exceed normal patterns. One data point that multiple observers have noted is the removal of Defense Minister Li Shangfu in late 2023, less than a year after his appointment. Li was a former Rocket Force commander, and his sudden disappearance from public events followed by official confirmation of his removal raised immediate questions. Was this corruption? Was this political disloyalty? Or was this something else? Now, the Chinese government provided limited official explanation, citing only vague references to serious disciplinary violations. Now, here is where the confirmed facts end and the speculation begins. Some reports, primarily circulating through regional outlets and social media platforms, have claimed that these personnel changes represent more than anti-corruption campaigns. These unverified claims suggest that Xi Jinping faces organized resistance within the military, that factions loyal to previous leadership or regional power centers are pushing back against his centralization of authority, and that this resistance has manifested in refusal to implement orders, slow-rolling reforms, or even discussions of contingency plans should Xi's leadership falter. We need to be exceptionally clear about this. There is no credible, independently verified evidence of an organized military plot, a coup attempt, or armed resistance against Xi Jinping's authority. What we have is a pattern of removals, a lack of transparency, and an environment ripe for speculation. That speculation does not equal confirmation. Why is this happening? To understand the mechanisms at play, we need to step back and look at the structural pressures inside the People's Liberation Army and the broader Chinese political system. The People's Liberation Army is not just a military, it is a party institution designed from its founding to serve the Communist Party first and the state second. That arrangement worked relatively smoothly when party leadership was collective, when power was distributed across a standing committee, and when military careers advanced through a combination of competence, patronage networks, and regional balancing. Xi Jinping changed that system. Since taking power in 2012, Xi has systematically dismantled collective leadership, purged rivals through anti-corruption campaigns, restructured the military command system, and concentrated decision-making authority in his own hands. He abolished term limits, declared himself corps leader, and embedded loyalists throughout the officer corps. That centralization brought efficiency in some areas. Command chains were streamlined, redundant structures were eliminated. The Central Military Commission, which Xi chairs, became the unquestioned center of military authority. Regional commanders who once wielded significant autonomy found themselves answering directly to Beijing with unprecedented frequency. The theater command system, implemented in 2016, was designed to enable joint operations and reduce inter-service rivalry. On paper, it looked like modernization. In practice, it also concentrated power, but it also created new vulnerabilities. When power concentrates, dissent does not disappear, it goes underground. Officers who might have voiced concerns in a more collective system now have no outlet. Those who owe their careers to previous patrons, leaders like Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, who built their own networks during their time in power, find themselves sidelined. Loyalty networks that took decades to build were dismantled through purges framed as anti-corruption drives. And those who disagree with strategic priorities, resource allocation, or operational readiness standards have no formal mechanism to push back without risking their careers or worse. This is the hidden trade-off of Xi's consolidation. He gained control, but he lost the institutional release valves that allowed for internal debate and course correction. And in a military system where loyalty is enforced through fear of purges, the result is not always obedience. Sometimes it is paralysis, sometimes it is resentment, and sometimes it is quiet sabotage. The Rocket Force purges illustrate this dynamic. According to public reporting from sources including Reuters and the Financial Times, the Rocket Force underwent massive expansion and modernization under Xi's direction. New missile systems were deployed, nuclear arsenals were expanded, command structures were reorganized, but along the way, allegations of corruption emerged. Not petty theft, but systemic issues involving defense procurement, construction contracts for missile bases, and kickbacks tied to equipment acquisitions. When Xi launched investigations, he reportedly discovered that some of the very officers he had promoted were involved. This created a dilemma. Purge too many, and you decapitate the command structure of your most critical strategic force. Purge too few, and you signal that corruption is tolerated if you are politically connected. Xi chose the former. He removed officers, restructured chains of command, and installed new leadership. But that decision came with costs. What does it cost to gut the leadership of a strategic missile force in the middle of heightened tensions over Taiwan? The answer is operational risk. Missile forces are not infantry units where you can rotate commanders with minimal disruption. These are highly technical organizations where institutional knowledge, operational experience, and trust between commanders and technical specialists matter enormously. When you remove the top tier of leadership, you create gaps. New commanders need time to learn their portfolios. Staff officers need time to build confidence in new leaders. And during that transition period, readiness can suffer. This does not mean the rocket force is non-functional. It means that for a window of months, possibly longer, the force is operating below optimal capacity. And if your strategic calculus depends on being able to execute precision missile strikes in the opening hours of a conflict, that gap matters. But here is the catch. This does not mean what you might think it means. A weakened rocket force does not necessarily make China less dangerous. It might make Beijing more cautious about initiating conflict, knowing that a key element of its operational plan is compromised. Or it might make Beijing more aggressive, seeking to demonstrate strength precisely because internal coherence is in question. The relationship between internal military turbulence and external behavior is not linear. History is filled with examples of regimes that lashed out externally to distract from internal problems. It is also filled with examples of regimes that became risk-averse when they sensed internal weakness. We cannot predict which path China will take based on personnel changes alone. There is another dimension to this that often gets overlooked in Western analysis. The People's Liberation Army Officer Corps is not monolithic. It includes officers who rose through ground forces focused on internal stability and border defense. It includes naval officers trained in blue water operations and power projection. It includes Air Force officers schooled in modern joint operations. And it includes Rocket Force officers who see themselves as the guardians of strategic deterrence. These communities have different institutional cultures, different priorities, and sometimes different strategic outlooks. When Xi restructures the military, he is not just shuffling names on an organizational chart. He is navigating factional tensions that have existed for decades. Some of the removals we are seeing may reflect genuine corruption. Others may reflect Xi sidelining officers whose institutional loyalties or strategic views he does not trust. And some may simply reflect bureaucratic power struggles that have little to do with loyalty or competence. The pressure point in all of this is not whether a coup is imminent. It is whether the People's Liberation Army can function as a coherent fighting force if called upon. Modern military operations require trust, coordination, and institutional confidence. If officers are looking over their shoulders, worried that any mistake will be interpreted as disloyalty and result in investigation, that creates a culture of risk aversion. Risk aversion in peacetime might mean nothing. Risk aversion in crisis might mean hesitation at critical moments, failure to adapt to battlefield conditions, or paralysis when rapid decision-making is required. And if Beijing's strategic plans assume that the People's Liberation Army can execute complex joint operations across multiple domains simultaneously, any degradation in command confidence is a serious problem. What it costs on a human and institutional level is harder to measure but equally important. When you purge senior officers, you send a message to the entire officer corps. That message can be read in multiple ways. It can signal that corruption will not be tolerated, which might improve morale among those who resent the patronage networks. Or it can signal that no one is safe, that political loyalty matters more than competence, and that survival depends on reading the political winds correctly rather than focusing on operational readiness. Night reports from regional analysts who monitor Chinese military social media and unofficial forums suggest a mix of both reactions. Some officers reportedly view the purges as necessary house cleaning. Others see them as arbitrary and destabilizing. The truth is probably somewhere in between, varying by service branch, region, and individual career trajectory. Now, let us address the elephant in the room. The idea of a military turning against its leader is not unprecedented in Chinese history. The Communist Party itself came to power through military force. Mao relied on the People's Liberation Army to enforce his authority during the Cultural Revolution. And even in the reform era, the specter of military intervention in politics loomed during moments of crisis, most notably in 1989. But the modern People's Liberation Army operates under a fundamentally different structure than it did in the Mao era. It is professionalized, institutionalized, and deeply embedded within party control mechanisms. The chances of a traditional military coup where uniformed officers seize government buildings and announce a change in leadership are vanishingly small. The mechanisms of party control, including political commissars embedded at every level of command, multiple overlapping security services, and a promotion system that prioritizes political reliability, make such an outcome extremely unlikely. But unlikely does not mean impossible. And more importantly, the question is not whether tanks will roll into Beijing. The question is whether Xi Jinping's ability to command absolute obedience within the military is as solid as it appears. If senior officers are being removed not for corruption, but for insufficient loyalty, that suggests Xi perceives a threat. If those removals are happening across multiple service branches simultaneously, that suggests the perceived threat is broad. And if the response to that perceived threat is to install loyalists regardless of their operational competence, that creates a different kind of risk. Not the risk of overthrow, but the risk of incompetence, the risk of groupthink, and the risk of a military leadership that tells Xi what he wants to hear rather than what he needs to know. 3 scenarios are possible in the weeks and months ahead. First, stabilization. Xi completes his personnel reshuffling, installs trusted commanders across all key positions, and the People's Liberation Army returns to normal operational tempo. In this scenario, the purges were a necessary correction, and the turbulence was temporary. What would we see if this is happening? We would see new appointments announced through official channels, with biographical details and public ceremonies that signal confidence and continuity. We would see resumed military exercises at pre-purge frequency and scale, particularly large-scale joint operations that require coordination across multiple service branches. Watch for announcements of Rocket Force missile tests, naval exercises in the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea, and Air Force drills that demonstrate operational readiness. We would see a reduction in speculative reporting about internal military tensions as the information environment stabilizes. And critically, we would see Xi himself appearing at military events, inspecting units and delivering speeches that emphasize unity and capability. This is the scenario that Beijing wants the world to believe is already occurring. If it is true, the indicators will be unmistakable. Second, continued erosion. The personnel changes are symptoms of deeper structural problems that cannot be fixed through reshuffling alone. Corruption is too embedded, woven into procurement systems, promotion pathways, and resource allocation decisions at every level. Factional tensions are too entrenched, with competing loyalty networks still operating beneath the surface, despite Xi's purges. And Xi's centralization has created a system where problems are hidden rather than solved, where subordinates tell leaders what they want to hear rather than reporting uncomfortable truths. In this scenario, we would see continued reports of removals, with new names disappearing from public rosters every few months. We would see unexplained absences of senior officers from public events, particularly from annual gatherings like the National People's Congress, or major military commemorations where attendance is normally mandatory. And we would see signs of reduced operational readiness, such as canceled or scaled back exercises, delayed procurement programs for critical weapon systems, or gaps in expected military activities that normally follow predictable patterns. Watch for inconsistencies in reporting from Chinese state media, where exercises that should be routine receive unusual emphasis, suggesting they are being used to project normalcy. This would be a slow degradation rather than a sudden collapse, but over time it would significantly impact China's ability to execute complex military operations. If this scenario unfolds, it will not be obvious at first. The signs will be subtle, visible only to those tracking long-term patterns and comparing current activity levels to historical baselines. Third, localized resistance. Some elements within the People's Liberation Army resist Xi's direction, not through open defiance but through passive non-compliance. Orders are followed slowly, reforms are implemented half-heartedly, and when crises emerge, the response is sluggish or fragmented. This scenario does not involve coup plots. It involves bureaucratic friction at scale. What would we see? We would see inconsistent performance across different military regions or service branches. We would see some units conducting high-profile exercises while others remain conspicuously quiet. And we would see signs that Xi is micromanaging military affairs more directly, bypassing normal command channels because he does not trust them. Which scenario is most likely? Based on publicly available information, we cannot say with certainty. Each has elements that align with current reporting. The pattern of removals suggests Xi is concerned about loyalty, which supports scenarios 2 or 3. But the fact that the People's Liberation Army continues to conduct large-scale exercises and that no major operational failures have been publicly reported suggests scenario 1 might be closer to reality. The most probable outcome is some combination, where Xi successfully consolidates control in some areas while ongoing tensions persist in others. What does this mean for the region? If the People's Liberation Army is experiencing internal turbulence, that has direct implications for Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, and every other nation within range of Chinese military power. A coherent, confident military is more predictable. A military undergoing internal stress is less so. It might be more cautious, avoiding actions that could expose internal weaknesses. Or it might be more aggressive, seeking to demonstrate strength and distract from internal problems. The uncertainty itself is destabilizing. When your neighbor's military is in flux, you cannot assume that past patterns of behavior will hold. That forces defense planners to prepare for a wider range of scenarios, which in turn drives military buildups, increased exercises, and heightened alert levels, all of which increase the risk of miscalculation. For the United States and its allies, the key question is not whether China's military is weaker or stronger today than it was a year ago. The key question is whether it is more or less stable. A stable adversary, even a powerful one, is manageable through deterrence and diplomacy. An unstable adversary is unpredictable. And unpredictability in a nuclear-armed state with the world's second-largest economy and territorial disputes across multiple flashpoints is a problem that extends far beyond military analysis. It touches on global supply chains, financial markets, and the basic architecture of international order. 3 takeaways matter most. First, the confirmed facts. China has removed multiple senior military officers, restructured key commands, and conducted what Beijing describes as anti-corruption campaigns within the People's Liberation Army. These are not rumors. These are documented through official Chinese sources. Second, the speculation. Claims of organized military resistance, coup plotting, or factional warfare remain unverified. They circulate widely, they fit certain narratives, but they lack credible evidence. Treat them as possibilities, not certainties. Third, the implication. Even without a coup, internal military turbulence in China creates risks that policymakers, defense analysts, and regional actors must account for. A military in transition is a military with vulnerabilities. How Beijing manages those vulnerabilities and how external actors respond to them will shape stability across the Indo-Pacific in the months ahead. This video is for educational and news commentary purposes only, based on publicly available information. Details may evolve as new reporting emerges.